Don't tell me you don't like this one. Why, he talks and everything.
Mm-hmm. He's all right. He's interesting.
Interesting?
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today I'm joined by Sam Chandler, who is the founder and CEO of Nitro, which has been funded by the likes of Battery Ventures as well as Starfish Ventures. Welcome to the show, Sam.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
So entrepreneurship is very much in your blood, and I believe that one of your first venture you started when you were only 16 years old. What was that?
I did indeed. It was a web design and email marketing business. I think when you reach that sort of mid-teenage, years period, and you have to do something to pay for all the things that, your parents won't give you pocket money for, I was really drawn to business from a very young age. And so rather than sort of walk down the street and apply at the local McDonald's or whatever else you might do, I was actually motivated to start my own thing.
Well, that's fascinating because, at that age, you technically can't even, I suppose, own a checking account, let alone have a legal, I suppose you can have a legal entity, but there are some things that you're not an adult, so you can't exactly transact. But here you are growing a business. And whatever happened to that first company that you started?
So I built that over several years. I actually built it, I grew up in a place called Tasmania, a state called Tasmania, which is the southern state off the coast of mainland Australia. And, growing up in the country, literally, I had a passion for entrepreneurship, just through reading over so many years about, all these business stories. And I think I was probably a massive fan of history as well, and sort of looked at the shape of the world and where the world had come from. And so, when I started that business, my goal was to basically pay my way, so to speak, through school. And indeed through university. And so I grew the business all through high school in Tasmania, and then into Victoria, into Melbourne when I moved to the mainland when I was 17 or 18. And that business continued. So I actually transformed that business from a services business into a product focused company in my early 20s. So really, Nitro was my third company. My first two companies was sort of one evolving into the other between the ages of kind of 16 and probably my early 20s. So probably 5 or 6 years in total.
So let's talk about Nitro. And over the years, I have to believe that you have pivoted and evolved the company. So can you share a little bit about the genesis of what was the hypothesis back then versus where you are today?
Yeah, look, when we started the company, we believed that document productivity should be available to everybody. And at the time, in the first market that we played in, which was PDF productivity, there was really just one incumbent player that I think everybody is familiar with. And we really wanted to disrupt that particular category. And our vision was to essentially provide amazing document productivity tools to end users that could be deployed very cost effectively and with a level of service experience that maybe you didn't get with the large incumbent. And so the original vision for the company really was that kind of universal document productivity, at compelling price points, and that includes free. In fact, freemium was a huge part of our original strategy. In terms of where we've evolved to since then, I think primarily the company has evolved from selling to small businesses, including kind of Soho and prosumer, up into the enterprise. If you really look at Nitro's last 3 to 5 years, we've moved from just selling to small and mid-sized businesses to selling to the largest companies in the world. I mean, we count GE and Caterpillar and ExxonMobil and United Health Group and a bunch of other sort of Fortune 100, even Fortune 10 companies as customers today. So the product vision really has evolved from just document productivity into also document workflow, particularly e-signing, and analytics or BI as well. But a lot of the original thesis for the company and our passion around delivering great software at reasonable prices, continues to this day.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting strategy that you guys have employed, because when you guys were just starting out, especially my understanding was in the earlier years, you guys were bootstrapping it. So had you tried to start out trying to sell directly into the enterprise B2B market, especially with the long sales cycle, that would have been very kind of almost incongruent with your cash flow and your resources. And that would have been very challenging. So in some sense, I think taking smaller bites and growing kind of a ground roots swell, so to speak, that allows for enough of the individual users to say, hey, we need to really think about bringing this to the organization.
Yeah, we started very much selling exclusively online with a freemium strategy, and we did bootstrap for the first 2 years. We didn't take any outside capital until about 2 years in. And even then, that was a very small kind of typical seed round, if you will. It was about $1 million Australian. And in that period, we were really looking for the most cost-effective go-to-market model, given the lack of capital and access to capital that we had. As we started to grow revenues, and we generated revenue right out of the gate. That's why we could bootstrap. We did a few $100,000 in revenue in our first year. And that very quickly went to over $1 million. So we were paying our way from basically day one. And the evolution of our go-to-market is somewhat aligned with our access to capital, and growth in revenue. So we started with freemium. We were just selling online. We then moved to an inside sales team, primarily receiving inbound customer demand and servicing that. And it's really only in the last 5 years that we've started to build your traditional enterprise go-to-market with that outbound motion, with the all the capital requirements that entails.
Well, I think one of the subcontexts that we have to be mindful is, the capital markets, especially around kind of the early stage and even the institutional rounds in Australia, is not going to be the same as in Silicon Valley, where you're currently based in. So trying to raise that right level of capital where you were domiciled back then was I'm sure have to be somewhat challenging. But more so than that, I want to reframe a little bit in the sense that it's not that it was only a limitation around the capital raise, but it was a philosophy, and that's the sense that I get, is that some entrepreneurs, especially in the kind of the bi-coast of the US, are kind of in this belief system that you raise as much as possible and you burn through as quickly as possible. But here, there's a certain degree of philosophy that has discipline and something grounded than some of the other startups that I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, Scott, and you're right. It's partly out of necessity and partly a pretty deep-rooted philosophy. So growing up, I was a big fan of Ben Graham and Warren Buffett, and loved value investing and still do. And I did believe in the ability of technology companies in particular to be actually the equivalent of very good modern value investments. You have these companies that can produce large amounts of cash and earnings, so they sort of fit that traditional value investing view of the world. But of course, they're very high growth, and they can actually be cash burning, in the early years, which is totally fine if you understand that the unit economics at scale, can and will work. And so we actually made a decision very early on that we would build a company that was here for the long term. We thought that the document productivity market and the document workflow market was so massive that it would support and sustain a company over not just 2 or 3 years, but 5 or 10 years. And here we are 15 years in and kind of still growing, and we feel like we're not even halfway to where we think we can be. So it was a real deliberate choice to kind of pick a big market that we could attack for many, many years, build the company in a disciplined way. And look, I can say now, looking, going back 15 years, we've sort of done every different mode of financial profile you could imagine. We've done bootstrapping, we've done very little capital, we've done, profitable, we've done cash flow break even, we've done burn lots of cash. When we began our transition to the enterprise and subscription and all that stuff, we were burning $10 million a year for a couple of years there, That was very different to the early days of eking out that single-digit thousands of dollars of profit a month. And we've done a Series A round, we've done a Series B round, we've done a Series C round that was also kind of a pre-IPO round, and we've done our IPO, which was 110 million Australian dollars. So we've kind of done the whole gamut. If you look at the company now, though, we're kind of in a financial growth profile where we're high growth, but not really burning any cash. We're kind of almost cash flow break even on an operating basis, and so we feel like we've got. The way I look at the business today is that it's really a business that can survive any kind of economic climate. So yeah, we've done a bit of everything, but it was rooted in that philosophy of sustainable growth, and it started with being in Australia in the mid 2000s, the capital markets were not well developed. So even if we'd wanted for VC anyway, so even if we had wanted to go and raise a lot of money, we probably couldn't have.
Yeah, I want to go back to your earliest comment around the fact that you are somewhat of a history buff and you really carefully study key entrepreneurial figures in our human history. And I get the sense that there's a lot of kind of thoughtful thinking that is looking for that best practices. And one of the things that you mentioned, and I think you were spot on, is even early on, before you could really kind of concretely, in a crystallized fashion, see where the online market could go, you saw the potential that the total addressable market, the TAM, was big enough, and that this was truly a sustainable business that is not subject to not even seasonality, let alone things like pandemic. Which brings me to my next question: is how has COVID affected your business, and how is that actually accelerating the digital workflow and helping businesses to shift to remote work?
Yeah, look, if you think about the impacts of COVID from an external and internal point of view, from an internal point of view, it has barely affected Nitro's operations at all. We already had a percentage of the team that was remote or distributed. Moving everybody, the balance of the team to fully remote when COVID emerged was straightforward. We were actually measuring all of these productivity metrics across different parts of the business, and we were pretty much green on everything within a couple of weeks of sending everybody, home. And so, once you got past literally this very basic blocking and tackling of getting machines set up at home and desks and, extra monitors and faster internet and better chairs and all those things, most of our productivity metrics were green. So I think from an internal perspective, it's, like a lot of software companies that are already working very digitally, it was very easy for us to make that shift. And actually, we've just gotten better and better and better at it over the last 3 or 4 months. So I think we'll actually be moving to some sort of a flexible working model, even when we can get back into our offices, because we're seeing increased productivity in many places. Probably overall, let's say it's a net productivity gain having people at home, which is kind of, I'm sure that's what a lot of companies are finding, but I'm sure that that's also surprising to many people. So I think from an internal perspective, it's been very easy to manage. From an external perspective, that's where it gets more interesting, because we, of course, provide digitization tools and solutions, right? Fundamentally what we do is enable companies to move to 100% digital document workflows. And if you look at many of our largest customers, their digitization projects, their digital transformation, goals were usually measured in years or even in some cases, decade. Like we have lots of large customers with 10-year digital transformation plans, and they hope to get to fully electronic signatures by the end of 10 years. Well, right now, with everybody being remote, quite often it's a case of it's an e-signature or it's no signature. And so what we're seeing is this acceleration of years and years and years of digital transformation demand being pulled forward. And it's particularly exciting, I think, for those companies like Nitro that are serving these, digitization technologies markets, because there's definitely a very strong tailwind there. I mean, there's a lot of disruption happening right now just as a result of COVID, of course. And financial crises are always challenging things to navigate. But I do think the software companies that are inherently better positioned to deal with these kinds of global events, those that also happen to be aligned with digitization trends, are going to do pretty well, over the next several years.
I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and I think you have been working and chipping away for many years to be in that position, so you could take advantage of the bigger macro trend. Which brings me to my next question around the fact that you guys are making incredible progress. You guys are listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. And you made a recent comment in one of the publications or interviews saying that we'll give Adobe a run for their money. Can you elaborate? And what makes Nitro Sign different and a better, perhaps, offering from the competitors?
Well, if you go back to some of my earlier comments about our goals when we entered this document productivity space, and we really do sort of 2 to 3 things predominantly today. We do PDF productivity, where we compete directly with Adobe, who we kind of launched against back in 2005. We were the first alternative, actually, to Adobe Acrobat. So we were the first kind of challenger to that PDF productivity incumbent. We also do e-signing. So you'll see us competing with the likes of DocuSign. And we also provide some very unique BI capabilities as well to our customers, which enables them to kind of visualize digital transformation. We actually track both product usage and adoption, and a bunch of things like productivity and green, scores and things like that. But we also track printing. So you can kind of, as you deploy Nitro, you actually can kind of see your digitization in real time. You see the adoption increasing, you see printing declining. It's a pretty, impressive kind of set of charts. But in terms of how we compare, I guess, to some of the others in the space, I mean, fundamentally, from the very beginning, we wanted to be a customer-oriented company with a very high, value placed on an emphasis on service. And so initially, we were probably, I think, winning a lot of business from Adobe in large part because they're not a particularly popular incumbent. I think that's probably whether it's fair or unfair to say it. Their customer base doesn't universally love them, whereas our customer base almost universally loves us, and that's a real X factor in every deal that we do, from new customer acquisition to the expansions along the way. When it comes to kind of the product comparison, though, we have had this vision for the last 4 or 5 years of basically providing an amount of value in the enterprise that comes through a multi-product strategy. That means that the value proposition for Nitro is very, very strong. You're actually not just getting PDF productivity from us or just getting e-signing. You're getting both of those things combined with BI that really lets you, it's a very powerful analytics platform, and those 3 things together are really a digital transformation solution. And so if you look at e-signing on its own, or you look at PDF productivity on its own, they're not, I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say they are exclusively point solutions. They could be more than that in many cases, for sure. But we're really a single vendor solution for both e-signing and PDF productivity, supported by this unique BI platform with a very, very high level of service wrapped around it. And so it's really enabled us to win some of the largest accounts in the world, you know, in the last number of years. And we're probably winning a Fortune 100 or FTSE 100 account from the big guys, you know, every quarter.
So again, going back to the narrative we talked about early on is, you know, this notion of you appreciate and really study history. So when I think about history and case studies like, let's say, Xerox, for instance, that really kind of own the space around document life cycle before things start to become really digitized, although I think they have gone to the digital vault to quite extent. But you keep on referencing this notion of digital transformation, and it's very interesting because you know, one of the things that I think that's propelling aside from the cost side is that more and more companies, especially the larger ones, are recognizing that they need to be not just simply profit driven, but that they need to align to some sort of a UN SDG goal. Because it is not just the flavor of the day, but it's really around transformation of industries and companies, especially when we're talking about paper. I mean, you know, we're going through reams and reams of paper, and that's coming from different types of fibers and ultimately trees. So the digital transformation or the transformation of the organization in collective has an impact to the economy as well as the climate and our sustainability. So to that end, I want to ask you, I think there was a report that you guys had released that looks at some of the key trends that's emerging. Curious to know how that ties in with some of the sustainability aspect and the transformation that we're talking about.
Very much so. In fact, the most significant reductions in printing ever, you know, really in the history of printing have happened in the last few months. So using Nitro Analytics, and yes, we published a report on this, because Nitro Analytics is collecting tens of millions of data events every day across our, you know, worldwide customer base. And it's, as I said before, it's tracking all the product usage, it's tracking all of the printing. What we were able to see, and we showed the aggregate view of this, you know, in our Future of Work report, was that essentially printing declined massively, in some cases by up to 90%, as lockdowns came into effect around the world. And we can map and plot this against all of the individual countries. So you can literally see the Italian lockdown coming into effect and printing falling off a cliff. I think Italy was down 80 or 85%. And this is within weeks. We saw the same thing in the UK, the same thing in the US. We probably didn't see as pronounced declines in places like Germany or Switzerland, where they are very sustainability focused already. There are much lower print volumes in some of those more green countries, you know, than elsewhere. But on average around the world, we probably saw print volumes drop by 80% or something like that. And there's some other research out there that suggests 90%, but our data, which is potentially more accurate, I would venture, is probably in the 80-85% range on average. And so that's the benefits for the planet, you know, are really, really significant. And so we were pretty excited to see those declines. Of course, if you think about it though, for companies that don't have a digital document solution to substitute those old paper-based processes, you know, with new electronic document processes, that just means that business processes have stopped happening, you know, in many cases. So a lot of contract workflows that were paper, if you couldn't, over the last several months, if you couldn't stand up an e-sign workflow, for example, or a digital forms workflow really quickly, those processes just didn't happen for weeks or months. So there's been the adoption of Nitro in the period, we saw corresponding, you know, for amongst our customers who do have Nitro, we're seeing corresponding increases in Nitro adoption. So their printing fell by 80 or 85%, but at the same time, Nitro's form filling tools and our e-signing tools got the increases in adoption were kind of 80, 85%, or in many cases a lot more. So it's been a very fascinating thing to watch, like a giant global experiment that we've been tracking. And we see lots of interesting things in that data that go well beyond just digital document tools and processes. For example, we've seen that the average work day, which people are still doing on average about 8 hours of work, but they're doing it over a much longer time frame. Like lunch breaks have shortened, but people are starting earlier and finishing later, and they're working more on the weekends as well. So we've actually seen it's been interesting with that analytics data set to see more than we expected, not just pages printed and those kinds of things, but really we're seeing a change in the way that people work.
It's really, really interesting. And I think, as part of the report that you referenced, I'm curious to look at some of the things that perhaps maybe isn't direct effect. So paper is one thing, but if you think about customarily signatures and contracts and agreements, whether you're a real estate agent or you're trying to do a mergers and acquisition, it really requires typically for people to have to converge in a same setting, maybe in front of a lawyer, and sign. And that is people driving to a certain destination, or that's people flying to different destinations. So when we talk about these types of transformation, the impact is actually much, much bigger than paper. It's the savings and the minimize pollution from less driving, less flying, all the things that require the physical orchestration. And here we're able to do it in a digital fashion. So it's interesting to see the dotted line in terms of the digital document lifecycle and workflow to the implication to something even greater than us. So my last question for you is, we always ask all of our guests is, do you have a product or project failure that you can share and the lessons learned?
Yeah, I mean, look, we've had plenty of failures over the last 15 years. The secret, I think, in building a company over the long term is to make the majority. You're making thousands of smaller decisions and a handful of big ones in any given period. And the trick really is to get the majority of the small ones right and to get all the big ones right. If you get a big one wrong, that can be pretty costly. But I think for us, if I was to try and point to any particular example of kind of lessons learned, I think there's something that's been on my mind a lot lately, which is trying to understand. This isn't a specific project, but this is more of a way to think about decision making. To understand the difference between an idea that was bad and execution that was bad. This becomes really important to startups, like whether it's early stage or late stage, because you're trying so many things. You've got to have a confidence level that what you are doing is conceptually right. And then, of course, you want to manage to the best possible outcome. But if I look at where Nitro has made mistakes over the last 15 years, quite often we didn't do something because we'd tried it before and it didn't work. Or we tried something that we thought was a great idea and actually was a great idea, but it wasn't well executed. And you've got to learn to distinguish over time, what was a good idea that's worth, persevering with again or trying again. And this is true when you're actually executing the strategy, because sometimes you might not think it's working, but in fact it could be, and you've just got to wait for the numbers to show up. But, if most business success is in large part down to, one part planning, one part execution, understanding which one of those dimensions, is right or wrong is really, really critical. And, I think by way of practical example, we're implementing some strategies right now at Nitro that some of the existing team would have tried previously and probably had a dim view of because they didn't work. Whereas, an alternative view might be that the idea was sound, we just didn't execute it well. And so I think there's a lesson in that for every entrepreneur. Like as you are thinking through new ideas, whether you're taking the playbooks from others or coming up with those strategies yourself, always take a first principles approach and try and be really objective about why something might or might not work, and also in that retrospective why it may or may not have worked.
Well, that is incredible, prudent and wise insight and advice in terms of distinction between great idea versus great execution or bad idea versus bad execution. So with that, I've been joined by Sam Chandler, who is the CEO of Nitro Software. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks so much, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.